Hey guys. Tonight, we begin not in a cozy bed, but on a rickety hospital cot, with the smell of carbolic acid, sweat, and something far worse in the air. It's Victorian England, where hospitals were less healing sanctuaries, and more like grim waiting rooms between life and death. Surgeons worked fast, patients screamed loud, and infection lurked on every instrument. The world is industrial, overcrowded. And if you were unlucky enough to end up in a Victorian hospital, your chances of walking out again were pretty slim. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft, steady hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just stepped into a Victorian hospital, and trust me, you don't want to see what comes next. It began with the smell. No amount of lace, perfume, or stiff upper lip could disguise it. A Victorian hospital didn't welcome you with crisp linen and antiseptic sparkle like some smug 21st century clinic. It assaulted you. The air carried a bouquet of rotting flesh, cheap gin, sweat gone sour, and the faint metallic tang of blood that had no business being outside the body. If you were unfortunate enough to enter as a patient, you might try breathing through your mouth, until you realized that tasted worse. You could chew on the atmosphere, like biting into a damp rag that had been used one too many times to mop up something unspeakable. The building itself didn't help. Tall brickwork that always seemed to lean just a little too far over the street, windows crusted with grime, and doors creaking as though they'd rather not open at all. Once inside, the walls closed in, plaster cracked and peeled like the flaky skin of a fever patient. Rats scurried freely, pausing to glare at newcomers, as if daring them to complain. They knew their place better than you did. Down the long corridors, light filtered in like a dying candle, yellow and watery, giving everything a sickly glow. Gas lamps flickered when they weren't smoking, and filling the place with an acrid haze that stung the eyes. It was almost enough to distract from the soundscape. Groans, hacking coughs, muttered prayers, and the occasional high-pitched scream when someone realized the surgery had begun without anything resembling pain relief. One might imagine that the hospital was a haven, a sanctuary, a place to mend. Instead, it was more like an ante-room to death. You came in injured and left in one of two states. Either carried out feet, first on a rough wooden stretcher, or staggering home, with fewer parts than you arrived with. Visitors whispered stories of men who walked in with a simple cut on the arm, only to die 2 days later in a puddle of pus, because infection spread like gossip in a drawing room. To modern ears it sounds exaggerated, almost theatrical. Yet walk those wards, and you'll quickly see there's nothing romantic about the good old days. Surgeons didn't so much operate as they attacked the body, armed with saws and knives that had recently been used on someone else and wiped, if at all, on their aprons. Hands were rarely washed, unless by accident in the rain. The very idea of germs was dismissed as fanciful nonsense, the kind of idea only cranks or foreigners could dream up. The patients didn't line up in neat, separated rooms. They sprawled in long, cavernous wards, row after row of cots, each holding a human bundle of misery. Some writhed in fever, some stared blankly at the ceiling with glassy eyes, and some coughed into rags already stiff with old blood. Privacy was as absent as antiseptic. You were just one more body in the endless tide of sickness, stacked together like crates in a warehouse. Imagine a woman, clutching her child, stepping inside for the first time. She freezes at the entrance, her bonnet slipping slightly as she looks down the length of the ward. The sound of hacking coughs rattles her ears, and a man near the window lets out a moan so deep it could shake glass. A nurse, if you could call her that, bustles by with a tray of instruments that clink like a butcher's tools. The mother hesitates, but desperation drives her forward. Outside, her child might die. Inside, well, at least there's the illusion of hope. And then there was the humor of it, though none intended. The nurses often wore expressions of permanent irritation, as if each patient had personally insulted them by daring to be sick. Their uniforms weren't the crisp, pristine gowns of later centuries. They were more likely to be stained, patched, and carrying smells of their own. One might say they resembled the kitchen staff of a low tavern more than medical professionals. Patients whispered that the only thing dirtier than the sheets were the nurses' aprons. It's hard not to chuckle, darkly, when one realizes that in some wards, alcohol flowed more freely than clean water. Doctors swore by gin as a disinfectant, though most of it seemed to be swallowed before reaching a wound. Patients too received doses, more to keep them docile than to help with pain. After all, nothing quiets a screaming man like a pint of spirits. If you think of your last unpleasant trip to a modern hospital, where the vending machine was out of chips or the Wi-Fi didn't connect, consider how your Victorian counterpart was handed a mug of gin and a rag to bite on. Suddenly that broken vending machine doesn't seem so bad, does it? What truly made the place hellish was the way death lingered. In modern hospitals, death is hushed away, whisked into private rooms, the sheets smoothed down before anyone notices. In the Victorian ward, death lay in the bed next to you, staring into the ceiling while the body slowly cooled. Sometimes, a corpse would remain until evening, waiting for someone to find time to wheel it away. Patients would roll over and pull the blanket tighter, pretending not to notice the pale face slackening beside them. Conversations continued, because what else could you do? When you're lying 6 inches from death, ignoring it becomes a survival skill. Doctors swept in like minor monarchs, trailing the stench of tobacco and arrogance. Their coats were rarely white, more often brown or black, though after enough blood, they all turned the same reddish hue. They examined patients briskly, sometimes prodding wounds with unwashed fingers, making notes in illegible scrawls. The patient might try to ask a question, only to be silenced with a glare. Medicine was not about listening, it was about authority. The doctor was always right, even when he was very, very wrong. In one corner, a man with a broken leg watches wide-eyed as the surgeon approaches. The leg must be amputated, the doctor declares. There is no need for delay. Assistants seize the man, ignoring his screams, while the saw is sharpened with a sound that could chill the bravest soul. There is no chloroform today, it hasn't reached this hospital yet. Instead, the man is given a stick to bite. The saw begins. The room fills with the metallic scent of blood, and within minutes, the leg is gone. The patient faints, which is frankly the best outcome. Someone mops up the mess with a rag and a shrug, and the tools are set aside for the next unlucky soul. And yet somehow, this was progress. Better than nothing, they said. Better to lose a leg than lose a life. Though, given the number of infections that spread afterward, that was optimistic at best. Many who endured the surgeon's saw still died days later, their stumps swelling with pus until the fever carried them off. But in the eyes of the hospital, the amputation was a success. The man survived the table. What happened after? That was someone else's concern. If you think the idea of a waiting room in today's hospital is a slow, boring torture, imagine sitting in a Victorian ward, listening to the man beside you scream as his leg is removed with nothing more than a gulp of gin. Imagine hearing the saw bite into bone, while you wonder if your own minor infection might bring you to the same table tomorrow. Suddenly, that 2-hour wait with an outdated magazine in hand doesn't sound so bad. Even the air itself seemed determined to finish the job. Ventilation was a word tossed about in medical journals, but rarely practiced. Windows stayed closed, trapping in the foulness, because drafts were considered unhealthy. As a result, the atmosphere grew thick, humid, and ripe with contagion. You could walk through a ward and feel the sickness clinging to your clothes like smoke after a bonfire. Visitors often left feeling queasy, convinced they had carried home something more than memories. And they were often right. Still, amid the horrors, life went on. Patients joked when they could, shared scraps of bread, or swapped gossip across beds. Humor was a shield, however thin. After all, if you didn't laugh at the absurdity of it, you might simply curl up and die a little faster. One man, coughing violently into his stained handkerchief, chuckled at a joke about the doctor's mustache looking like a small rodent. Another patient, missing half a finger, grinned and offered to lend a hand. Literally. In such places, dark humor was the only medicine that worked consistently. And so, each day in the Victorian hospital unfolded like a grim play, repeated over and over. Patients shuffled in, some staggered out, others were carried away, and still the beds remained full. The hospital didn't heal so much as it endured, swallowing suffering and spitting out stories that would one day sound like fiction. But it was all too real. And it was only the beginning of the nightmare. Because if you think the stench of the wards and the butchery of amputations were bad, wait until you see what passed for nursing in the next rooms. Step into the ward again, but this time, follow the sound of skirts rustling. The nurses have arrived, though that word must be used generously. They were often women hired not for training, but for their willingness to endure long hours of misery for a pittance. Think of them as the backbone of the hospital. Except this spine was bent wary, and occasionally drunk. Many were widows or women down on their luck, their aprons stiff with old stains, their shoes worn thin. Their job was less about healing and more about hauling. They carried chamber pots, changed soiled sheets, and occasionally tried to stop a patient from bleeding too much on the floor. Florence Nightingale may have been working wonders elsewhere, building her reputation as the lady with the lamp, but those reforms hadn't yet trickled down to every hospital. In most, nurses were closer to jailers than saints. They were tasked with order, not comfort, and if you begged for water, you might receive it, if they remembered. If not, you were left to sip condensation from the walls. At night, they patrolled the wards with the heavy tread of exhaustion, more interested in keeping things quiet than keeping people alive. And yes, the whispers were true, some drank on duty. A little gin to steady the nerves, they said. Though after the fourth cup, it steadied nothing at all. Patients sometimes found themselves staring up at a nurse with glassy eyes, her hands shaking as she attempted to dress a wound. If you've ever had a waiter bring your order to the wrong table, imagine that, but with a bandage applied to the wrong leg. You would want to send it back, but alas, there were no returns in this establishment. Visitors didn't fare much better. Hospitals were open enough that families could wander in, bringing food or comfort, only to find their loved one already gone. Or worse, still there but unrecognizable. Mothers clutched hands that had grown cold. Fathers stared at bodies they couldn't claim, and children were ushered away quickly, lest they catch the sickness themselves. A hospital visit could be a goodbye as often as a reunion. The beds themselves deserve a mention, if one can call them beds. Rough wooden frames, thin mattresses stuffed with straw, and sheets that hadn't seen boiling water in weeks. Lice and fleas enjoyed a thriving business, feasting on the helpless. A patient might arrive with a broken arm and leave, if they left at all, with an entirely new set of infestations. The scratching at night was constant, a chorus of irritation that joined the groans and wheezing to create an orchestra of suffering. And then there was the laundry, or rather, the lack of it. Hospitals operated on tight budgets, meaning sheets were used until they disintegrated. A stain wasn't a reason to replace linen. It was simply part of the fabric now, like a grim badge of honor. Fresh sheets were rare enough to feel like luxury, and patients who received them often joked that they must have accidentally wandered into the wrong ward. The sheets carried smells that clung stubbornly, as if determined to haunt anyone who lay upon them. If you've ever complained about the thin blanket provided on a long-haul flight, imagine being in a Victorian hospital where your blanket was not just thin, but stiff with dried fluids you'd rather not identify. Suddenly, that scratchy airplane pillow seems like 5-star comfort. Meals did little to lift spirits. Gruel was common, sometimes accompanied by bread hard enough to chip a tooth. Meat, when provided, was often grey and stringy, boiled until any flavour had been lost to the broth. Patients chewed slowly, not because they savoured it, but because their stomachs recoiled at the thought of swallowing. Occasionally, a charitable visitor brought fruit or sweets, and suddenly the ward would feel almost festive, until someone coughed blood into their portion, and the appetite vanished. Hunger was not the only problem. Clean water was scarce. Wells near the hospital often drew from contaminated sources, carrying cholera or typhoid in every gulp. Nurses sometimes boiled it, but more often they didn't. Patients drank what they were given, and many grew sicker because of it. The irony was not lost. You entered the hospital to escape illness, only to be poisoned by the very water offered as refreshment. Doctors continued their rounds, grand in their confidence. They leaned over patients, muttering Latin terms that sounded impressive, but often meant little. They believed in balancing humors, in bleeding to release illness, in purging the body through vomit or laxatives. A man with pneumonia might be prescribed a dose of mercury, which would certainly do something, just not what he hoped. Another with stomach pains might be advised to drink vinegar. The line between treatment and torture was thin, often indistinguishable. Consider the operating theatre, a spectacle in every sense. Patients were hauled in, pale and trembling while students crowded the benches above, eager for a show. Surgery was not private, it was public education. Gas lamps flickered on the knives, casting long shadows as the surgeon began. Blood spurted, saws screeched, and students scribbled notes or gagged into handkerchiefs. The patient's screams filled the room, echoing off the walls, while the surgeon barked instructions with the efficiency of a butcher calling orders. When chloroform and ether finally arrived, they were miracles, but dangerous ones. Dosages were inconsistent, equipment crude. Too little, and the patient woke mid-surgery to horrors unimaginable. Too much, and the patient simply never woke at all. Surgeons experimented freely, as if human beings were little more than test subjects. Many did not survive the experiment, but progress demanded sacrifices, and who better than the poor souls already doomed by disease or injury? If you've ever been put to sleep for a wisdom tooth extraction, only to wake up groggy and confused, imagine instead waking up halfway through a leg amputation, with the saw grinding away. You'd probably wish the anesthetic had never worn off. The atmosphere weighed on everyone. Patients grew restless, nurses grew wary, and even the rats seemed to move slower, burdened by the heaviness in the air. The hospital was less a place of healing than a waiting room for death, where every cough carried a question mark, every shadow hinted at the end. And yet, despite it all, people came. They came because there was no alternative, because even hell offered hope if you squinted hard enough. They came with broken bones, fevers, infections, childbirth complications, and wounds from factory accidents. They came because to stay at home meant certain death, while the hospital at least offered a fighting chance. It was the cruelest gamble: endure the filth and risk infection, or surrender to illness alone. There's a peculiar resilience in humanity, though. Patients made friends across beds, shared stories of home, sang songs in quiet voices to drown the moans. Nurses, for all their faults, sometimes showed kindness, tucking a blanket around a shivering child, or sneaking extra bread to the hungry. Even doctors occasionally softened, sitting at a bedside and holding a hand, if only for a moment. Amid the horror, sparks of compassion glimmered, but those sparks did little to disguise the darkness. For every act of kindness, there were 10 acts of negligence, cruelty, or simple ignorance. The hospital was a paradox, a place meant to heal that so often harmed, a sanctuary that doubled as a tomb. And if you think the nurses' gin, the filthy sheets, and the bone-saw surgeries are the worst of it, well, brace yourself, because what happened when infections spread unchecked, when wounds festered, and when death came not as a whisper, but as a roaring epidemic, makes all of this look almost merciful. The wards were never quiet for long. The moment one patient's groans faded into silence, another's began. But there was a more sinister sound lurking underneath, the gurgle of infection, the wet rasp of lungs filling with fluid, the sucking hiss of pus being pressed from a wound. If the first horror of Victorian hospitals was the filth, the second was the infection that followed it everywhere, a shadow no one could shake. Infection was not merely a possibility, it was an inevitability. The very act of entering a hospital meant placing yourself in the path of invisible assassins, killers that no one could see but everyone could smell. The air itself was heavy with them, though Victorians didn't call them germs yet. They spoke instead of miasmas, of bad air rising from filth, of poisonous vapors curling into lungs. It was not entirely wrong, but it missed the mark, like blaming the smoke while ignoring the fire. Surgeons rarely washed their hands. They moved from patient to patient as though their fingers were immune, dipping into open wounds, stitching torn flesh, and wiping the excess onto their aprons. Those aprons, by the way, were rarely cleaned. They were worn with pride, stiff with layers of dried blood and bodily fluids, like a soldier displaying his medals. Each stain was a story, each crust a grim reminder of patients past. To modern eyes, they would look like crime scenes in cloth. To Victorians, they were credentials. The instruments were no better. Knives, saws, clamps, and needles were rinsed in cold water, if they were rinsed at all. More often, they were wiped on a sleeve or a rag and plunged into the next unfortunate body. Rust clung stubbornly to the blades, dulling their edges. Splinters of bone clung to the saws, carried like grotesque souvenirs from one surgery to the next. If the first cut didn't kill you, the infection that followed almost certainly would. Gangrene was a frequent visitor. A wound, even a small one, could rot in days. Flesh darkened to a sickly green. The stench of decay filling the ward until even the rats recoiled. Flies buzzed eagerly, drawn to the feast, and nurses tried to cover the smell with vinegar-soaked cloths. The patient writhed in agony, skin hot with fever, delirious with pain. Amputation was the only cure, if one could call it that, and so the sore returned, hungry as ever. There was no word quite so feared as hospital gangrene. It spread like wildfire through wards, leaping from bed to bed, consuming patients in grotesque waves. Skin sloughed off, wounds bubbled with foul discharge, and the smell clung to hair and clothing like a curse. Families stopped visiting when gangrene broke out, not out of fear alone, but out of revulsion. Even the bravest could not endure the sight for long. Childbirth was no safer. Women came to deliver babies, only to find themselves victims of puerperal fever. Doctors moved from corpses in the morgue to mothers in labor, without pausing to wash their hands. The result was predictable and horrific. Infections that burned through bodies, turning joy into mourning. Entire wards of new mothers perished, their babies left orphans within hours of birth. And still, few doctors accepted that their own unwashed hands were the culprits. If you've ever caught yourself touching your face after handling raw chicken, and then panicking about salmonella, imagine that. But your doctor has just finished dissecting a corpse, and then reaches for you with the same hands. You'd probably want to swat him away with the force of a cricket bat. Patients feared the smell most of all. They called it the hospital smell, an odor that clung to the nostrils and followed you even when you escaped. It was the smell of rot, of wounds uncleaned, of bodies decaying within living flesh. The scent was so strong it soaked into clothing, so that visitors carried it home with them, spreading the perfume of suffering across the city. To smell like the hospital was to wear death as cologne. There were attempts at remedies, of course. Doctors sprinkled carbolic acid, fumigated rooms with burning herbs, or doused wounds with brandy. These treatments sometimes helped, but more often they were too late. By the time infection was visible, it was usually unstoppable. Patients who survived did so less because of medical skill, and more because of sheer luck and stubborn constitutions. It wasn't until Joseph Lister began promoting antiseptic techniques, in the later part of the century, that change truly began. He insisted on sterilizing instruments, cleaning wounds with carbolic acid, and even, shockingly, washing hands. Many colleagues mocked him, calling it excessive, unnecessary, even ridiculous. But the numbers spoke louder. Patients stopped dying quite so quickly when he was around. Yet reforms were slow to spread. For decades, countless lives were lost to infections that today would be banished with a squirt of hand sanitizer and a clean needle. The irony is painful. In an age of expanding science, of railways and telegraphs and empire, something as simple as soap could have saved thousands. And yet it was overlooked, dismissed, even ridiculed. Progress had to claw its way through layers of arrogance and tradition, each death a cruel footnote in the struggle for better care. And so the hospitals remained breeding grounds. A man who entered with a broken leg might survive the fracture, but perish from the wound turning foul. A woman delivering a child might lose her battle not to the labor, but to the fever that followed. Children, weak and small, stood little chance at all. If you've ever rolled your eyes at the endless reminders to wash your hands during flu season, remember. Those reminders are written in the blood of Victorian patients. They are the ghosts of men and women who suffered because someone thought soap was optional. Yet as foul as the infections were, they weren't the only predator stalking the wards. For beyond the smell of decay and the sight of rotting flesh, another terror waited, one that preyed not on the body, but on the very spirit, the experiments of doctors, determined to turn human suffering into lessons, often at a cost no patient would have willingly paid. The experiments were dressed up as progress. Doctors spoke of them as noble, as necessary sacrifices for the advancement of science. But for the patients, they felt less like sacrifices and more like thefts. The theft of dignity, of hope, of the simple right not to be treated like a piece of meat. Hospitals became classrooms, and patients unwilling pupils. Every bed was a lesson, every body an opportunity. Doctors dragged students in groups from cot to cot, pulling back sheets to reveal rashes, tumors, deformities. They pointed with instruments, prodded with fingers, laughed at unusual cases as though the suffering were entertainment. And all the while, the patient stared upward, cheeks burning, humiliated but powerless. Operations were the true theatre. Surgeons loved an audience, and the operating theatres were packed. Wooden benches rose like stadium seating, filled with young men eager to learn, or faint. Surgeons strutted across the stage like performers, narrating their every move, playing to the crowd as much as to the wound before them. The patient lay strapped to the table, eyes wide, or if lucky, barely unconscious under chloroform. But luck was fickle. Many awoke halfway through, screaming into the rafters while students scribbled furiously. The worst part was that many procedures were unnecessary. A surgeon eager to demonstrate a technique might choose a patient simply because they were convenient. Amputations, trepanning, tumor removals, sometimes done more for the spectacle than the need. Patients were often too poor or too desperate to protest. They accepted the surgeon's word because what else could they do? Who else would help them? And sometimes, the help came not from doctors but from inventors. The 19th century was an age of gadgets, of contraptions that promised miracles. Hospitals were fertile ground for trials. Patients were hooked to experimental machines, injected with strange chemicals, or subjected to bizarre therapies. Electricity, for instance, was hailed as a cure for everything from paralysis to melancholy. Electrodes were strapped to temples, currents run through bodies until muscles convulsed and teeth clenched. Doctors nodded approvingly, declaring progress, while the patient shuddered in terror. If you've ever agreed to be a beta tester for a new app, and then watched it crash your entire phone, imagine that, but with the stakes being your nervous system. There were also the infamous cadaver lessons. Medical schools needed bodies, and hospitals supplied them. Corpses were dissected daily, their parts passed around like gruesome show and tell. Students held hearts in their palms, lungs against their cheeks, intestines coiled like ropes across desks. The smell was overwhelming, but the fascination greater. Some hospitals stored cadavers in cellars, stacked like firewood, leaking fluids that seeped through the floorboards. Patients above knew what lay beneath, and the thought weighed on them. For many, it was a preview of their own fate. Even when alive, a patient was not safe from dissection. Those who lingered near death were eyed carefully, their conditions noted, their decline measured. Doctors whispered to students, "Watch closely. Soon we will see inside." Death was less an end than a beginning, the start of a lesson. Families who failed to claim bodies quickly sometimes returned to find them already carved, their loved ones transformed into specimens for science. There were charitable motives mixed in, to be fair. Doctors truly did wish to learn to cure, to advance knowledge. And much of modern medicine was built on these foundations. But for the patients of the Victorian hospital, this was cold comfort. Few lived long enough to see those benefits, and fewer still consented willingly. Their pain was currency in a marketplace of knowledge, and the price was steep. Students, for their part, developed a gallows humor. They joked about cadavers, about the shrieks of the living, about the endless smell that clung to their coats. It was a defense, a way to survive the horror. But for patients, there was no such shield. They endured the laughter as salt in their wounds, proof that their suffering was spectacle. Not all doctors were cruel. Some wept privately, torn between duty and conscience. Some argued for gentler care, for respect, for listening to patients as more than cases, and slowly, reformers emerged. Figures like Lister, like Nightingale, championing cleanliness, dignity, compassion. But until their voices became law, the majority of patients were little more than exhibits in a gallery of misery. The effect on morale was crushing. Patients feared not only their illnesses, but their doctors. They whispered to each other in the wards, warning about surgeons with heavy hands, Students with curious eyes, inventors with wires and chemicals. Trust, once broken, rarely returned. Many begged their families to take them home, even if it meant certain death. Better to die in bed than to live as a lesson. And perhaps most chilling of all was how routine it became. The nurses grew used to screams, the doctors to the blood, the students to the stench. What horrifies modern ears was daily life for them, as ordinary as morning tea. That normalization was its own cruelty, a world where agony was simply background noise. If you think your annual checkup feels invasive when the doctor asks you to sit in a paper gown, remember in Victorian hospitals, you might have been undressed, displayed cut open, and examined in front of 50 strangers. Suddenly, that blood pressure cuff feels like a tender hug. Hospitals were meant to be sanctuaries. Instead, they became arenas where the weak were forced to fight battles they never volunteered for. Infection had already claimed many. Experimentation claimed more. And beyond both of these, there lurked an even more disturbing reality. What happened when the hospital itself ran out of space, out of beds, out of patients for the endless tide of the sick and the poor? For when the doors overflowed, the solutions found were every bit as cruel as the diseases themselves. The doors of a Victorian hospital were rarely shut. The poor came in droves, the injured staggered in, the sick collapsed at the threshold. But there were only so many beds, only so much space, and when the wards filled to bursting, the overflow had to go somewhere. And so began the practice that turned hospitals into warehouses of human suffering, overcrowding. Imagine a ward meant for 20 patients, now crammed with 50. Beds shoved side by side until there was no room to walk between them. Patients lying not just on cots but on benches, on floors, on stairwells. In some cases, 2 men were placed in a single bed, their fevers mingling, their coughs harmonizing into one dreadful chorus. If you've ever had to share a bed on a family vacation and fought for space against your siblings' flailing elbows, imagine doing that. But with tuberculosis. The air grew thick with breath, with sweat, with the unwashed bodies of dozens packed into a single room. Windows were few, often nailed shut to keep out the bad air. Ventilation was a cruel joke. The smell of urine, pus, and vomit hung heavy, clinging to the walls, the sheets, the very skin of anyone who entered. Visitors described it as overwhelming, a stench that struck like a physical blow. Noise was constant. Babies crying, men groaning, women calling for water, nurses barking orders, rats squeaking in the rafters. Sleep was a luxury rarely achieved. Patients drifted in and out of fever dreams, jolted awake by the screams of someone nearby being cut open without anesthetic. The line between day and night blurred. Time was measured in suffering rather than hours. Privacy did not exist. A woman giving birth did so within arm's reach of a man dying of cholera. A soldier with a shattered leg shared a ward with a factory worker coughing blood into his sheets. Conversations overlapped, confessions were overheard, sobs blended into the background. Deaths occurred in full view, the bodies left in place until nurses could find time to drag them away. Imagine drifting into uneasy sleep and waking to find the bed next to you empty, the sheet still warm, but the occupant gone forever. Doctors made their rounds briskly, if not callously. They swept through the ward like generals inspecting troops, nodding at cases, murmuring advice, moving on before a patient could even ask a question. With so many bodies crammed into one room, each individual became just that. A body, another tally in the endless ledger of the hospital. Names were forgotten, faces blurred together. You were not John or Mary anymore. You were the fever case, the amputation, the terminal one. Overcrowding bred not only infection but despair. The sick fed off one another's misery. A man hearing the cough of the patient beside him began to cough himself, partly from contagion, partly from dread. Children whimpered at the moans of the adults around them. Mothers tried to shield their infants from the sight of death, but found it impossible. The ward became a theatre of decay, where everyone played their part whether they wished to or not. If you've ever been trapped on public transport at rush hour, pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers, your patience fraying with every passing stop, imagine that. But you cannot get off, and the person pressed against you may be bleeding from a wound that reeks of rot. Suddenly, the sweaty commuter beside you feels like a bouquet of roses. The staff suffered too. Nurses moved from bed to bed without pause, exhaustion carving lines into their faces. They carried chamber pots through the aisles, their arms trembling from the weight, trying not to spill onto the already foul floors. Doctors grew impatient, their tempers snapping under the pressure of too many cases. Students scribbled frantically, trying to keep track of the endless stream of diseases and injuries. In such chaos, mistakes were inevitable. Wrong medicines, wrong dosages, wrong limbs amputated, blunders that cost lives, and yet no one had time to dwell on them. And then there was the morgue problem. With so many dying daily, bodies piled faster than they could be removed. Some hospitals designated corners of wards for the deceased, covering them with sheets until the porter could carry them away. Others sent corpses to basements where they stacked like cordwood, waiting for burial or dissection. The living knew the dead were near. They could smell it, hear the shuffling as porters dragged another body down the stairs. It was a grim reminder that any one of them might be next. Visitors described the wards as nightmarish. Charles Dickens himself wrote of hospitals as places of despair, where death is the great physician. Philanthropists lobbied for reforms and some improvements came, but slowly, haltingly. Until then, the poor continued to flood in, each new arrival squeezing into whatever space could be found, each hoping against hope for survival in a place designed to smother hope entirely. And yet amid the crush, humanity flickered. Patients formed bonds, whispered encouragement, shared scraps of bread or sips of water. They told jokes to lighten the mood, sang songs to drown the misery. In overcrowding, companionship was both curse and salvation. The proximity that spread disease also spread comfort, fragile though it was. But as the wards swelled beyond capacity, as patients lay stacked like cordwood, the question loomed, how far would the hospitals go to maintain their thin facade of order? For the answer was not mercy, but cruelty. Punishments and restraints that turned hospitals into prisons as much as places of healing. When bodies piled high and tempers wore thin, hospitals turned to control rather than comfort. The sick were not always compliant, after all. Fever made people restless, pain made them scream, delirium made them lash out. And in wards where dozens were crammed together, one patient's thrashing could disrupt an entire room. So doctors and nurses resorted to the tools of prisons, restraints, punishments, and cold discipline. Straps of leather bound wrists to bed frames, ropes tied ankles tight, iron shackles bit into skin. Patients too noisy, too unruly, or simply inconvenient were silenced by force. Some were gagged with cloth to keep them from disturbing the ward. Others were strapped down not just for surgery, but for days on end, their skin blistering under the pressure, their cries muffled to whispers. The rationale was simple: order must be kept. The humanity of the patient was secondary. The poor and the mentally ill fared worst. A man raving with fever was treated little differently than a lunatic, bound until exhaustion overcame him. Women in childbirth who cried too loudly were scolded, sometimes slapped, for disturbing the ward. Children terrified by the chaos were told to hush or risk the cane. It was discipline disguised as medicine, a belief that obedience itself might cure disease. There were quiet wards where difficult patients were dumped. These were dim, bare rooms where screaming and moaning were muffled by thick doors. Here, restraints were most common, and staff visited only when necessary. Patients were left alone with their suffering, shadows their only companions. Some never returned to the main ward, vanishing into silence until their bodies were carried out. If you've ever been annoyed by a hospital nurse telling you sternly that visiting hours are over, imagine instead being tied to the bed because you wouldn't stop crying from pain. Suddenly, that polite scolding feels like a warm hug. Punishments extended beyond physical restraints. Food was withheld from those considered troublesome. A patient who begged too often for water might be ignored for hours. Complaints were met with scorn, accusations of mistreatment dismissed as the ramblings of fever. The poor, in particular, had no recourse. Wealthier patients sometimes received kindness, but for the destitute there was only discipline. And yet, discipline did not always stop chaos. The overcrowded wards bred not only disease but violence. Patients fought over scraps of food, over bedding, over space. Fistfights broke out between men weakened by illness, their swings feeble but desperate. Nurses waded in, pulling them apart, sometimes with blows of their own, Surgeons barked orders like generals trying to restore order on a battlefield. The hospital was less a sanctuary than a war zone, each day a battle for dominance as much as for survival. Visitors were shocked by the cruelty. Some wrote letters, demanding reform, describing sights that chilled them: children bound, mothers gagged, men tied to beds until they soiled themselves. These accounts fueled debates in Parliament and in newspapers, sparking slow waves of change. But for the patients still inside, change could not come fast enough. Their days were measured in straps and silence. And still, not all restraint was cruel in intention. Some nurses, overwhelmed and undertrained, used ropes because they knew no other way. They feared a patient might harm themselves, or thrash so wildly as to worsen their condition. Without proper knowledge, they fell back on the only tools at hand. It was ignorance as much as malice. But ignorance burns no less painfully on the skin. The mental strain was immense. Patients treated like prisoners grew hopeless, their will to live eroding. They ceased fighting, ceased eating, ceased trying. Their bodies weakened, infections spread faster, and death crept closer. In restraining the body, hospitals often strangled the spirit too. But the most chilling punishments were not the ropes or the gags. They were the threats. Patients were warned that if they did not behave, they would be sent to the dissecting room after death, their bodies used for study. For the poor, this was no idle threat. The fear of dissection haunted Victorian society, and hospitals held the power to make it reality. Patients learned quickly silence, obedience, submission, or risk your very body being stolen in the end. If you think a stern nurse drawing the curtain around your bed feels isolating, imagine instead the threat of your corpse being carved before the ink on your death certificate is dry. Suddenly, that flimsy curtain feels like a fortress. Hospitals were meant to heal, but in their overcrowded, discipline-driven wards, they became institutions of control. Order mattered more than compassion, silence more than comfort. And while the straps and shackles left visible marks, there were other cruelties less obvious, but just as devastating. For beyond the ropes and gags lay a horror that clung not to the body, but to the senses: the unbearable filth, the crawling infestations, the vermin that made every night a battle, not just against illness, but against the smallest, hungriest enemies imaginable. Nightfall in a Victorian hospital was never truly dark, but it was never truly quiet either. Lamps hissed with dim, smoky light, casting more shadow than glow. Patients tossed on straw mattresses, moaning in pain. Rats skittered beneath the cots, their claws tapping like impatient fingernails on wood. And in the silence between coughs, there came another sound: the soft, persistent rustle of things far smaller, things that lived in the seams of clothing, in the folds of blankets, and in the cracks of wooden beds. The hospital did not merely suffer from filth. It seethed with life, the kind of life nobody wanted. Fleas leapt from patient to patient. Bedbugs feasted on blood through the night. And lice crawled so freely that even the staff itched beneath their uniforms. Patients scratched until their skin broke, nails red with blood, bites swelling into angry welts. And yet, there was no escape. To enter the hospital was to enter into a pact. With these creatures your blood would be shared, willingly or not. It was not only insects that plagued the wards. The rats ruled as boldly as kings. They scurried over tables, gnawed at scraps of food, and sometimes, when hunger sharpened their courage, nibbled at the toes or fingers of the sleeping. Nurses woke to screams, fumbling with lamps, only to find teeth marks etched into pale flesh. Children were especially vulnerable, small bodies unable to fend off the nocturnal predators. There were whispers of babies lost not to fever, but to rats. And if you imagine that is an exaggeration, remember, these were animals grown fat on a constant supply of bloodied bandages and unguarded meals. Imagine lying in your bed with a high fever, your skin clammy, your breath shallow. Suddenly, you feel movement across your legs. Too weak to rise, you brush at it, only to find not a blanket shifting but the heavy, hairy body of a rat making its evening patrol. And just as your heart races in terror, you notice the scratching, the itching, the relentless crawling of lice on your scalp. It was not healing that came with hospital nights, but an invasion. Doctors spoke often of miasma, of invisible poisons in the air. They missed what was in plain sight: the crawling, biting swarms that carried their own diseases. Typhus, nicknamed jail fever, spread easily in such environments, its primary carriers the lice that thrived on unwashed clothing and unclean skin. Fleas spread plague, and bed bugs, though not always deadly, left the sick restless and exhausted, unable to sleep in peace. Yet for decades, these infestations were treated as nuisances rather than threats. Beds were cleaned by beating the straw mattresses, which did little more than stir the insects into a frenzy. Sheets were rarely washed, for laundry was expensive and water scarce. Patients often arrived with lice in their hair or fleas in their rags, and the hospital welcomed these stowaways with open arms, offering them a feast of fresh victims. To fight one insect was impossible when the ward itself was an ecosystem, every crack and crevice alive. It's hard to feel sympathy for a modern mosquito buzzing at your ear when you're trying to sleep, until you realize its ancestors had cousins in Victorian wards, drinking deeply from fevered patients night after night. The mosquito at least leaves you annoyed. Lice and fleas left you scarred, diseased, and delirious. And then there was the smell. It was not only sweat and sickness, but the sour stench of vermin. Rat nests stank of ammonia. Bedbugs released a sickly sweet odor, pungent and cloying, that clung to sheets and skin alike. Patients described the odor as unforgettable, as though the air itself had turned rancid. Visitors sometimes gagged, covering their mouths with handkerchiefs, doused in perfume, though the stench seeped through fabric, a reminder that the hospital's walls were as alive as its inhabitants. Some patients tried to fight back. They scratched until their skin bled, rubbed vinegar into their hair to chase away lice, or kept a stick beside the bed to swipe at rats. But fever and weakness dulled the reflexes, and in time, most surrendered. They lay still while creatures fed, conserving strength for battles far greater than vermin. And perhaps that was the most disturbing part, how quickly one could become accustomed. By the second week, the crawling no longer shocked, the bites no longer drew screams. It was simply part of hospital life. Staff, too, suffered. Nurses woke itching from their own cots, scratching at lice beneath their uniforms, smacking at fleas that leapt from patient to floor to ankle. Some wore gloves not to protect against blood, but to keep their hands from constant bites. Doctors, in their arrogance, often ignored the problem, dismissing it as unavoidable, part of life among the poor. The wealthy had cleaner wards, though even these were not immune to the occasional scurry of a rat in the rafters. For the poor, the infestations were yet another reminder of their place. They were not people to be comforted, but bodies to be tolerated, their suffering compounded by creatures who knew no mercy. And when death came, vermin were often the first to notice. Rats sensed it in the stillness of the body, insects in the cooling of the skin. They arrived swiftly, nature's first mourners, consuming what was left before burial. If you've ever swatted at a fly during dinner, only to feel your appetite vanish, imagine trying to eat in a hospital where rats darted across the table and bugs crawled in the bread. Suddenly, that one fly doesn't seem so offensive. The infestations shaped more than daily discomfort. They shaped fear. Patients dreaded the night, when vermin were boldest. Some begged to be tied upright in chairs to keep the rats from their beds. Others whispered of strange tickling sensations, only to discover bites in the morning. Stories spread like wildfire of patients gnawed in their sleep, of lice burrowing into wounds, of fleas spreading fevers faster than the doctors could treat them. Whether all were true hardly mattered. The belief itself made the hospital feel cursed. And yet, in their strange way, the vermin served as a reminder. They were proof of how fragile human dignity was. In the hospital, stripped of possessions, clothing, privacy, and health, a patient's final insult was to be shared with creatures considered lower than dirt. One could be reduced from man or woman to simple meat, living flesh indistinguishable from the scraps tossed to rats. Reformers eventually fought to clean the hospitals, to fumigate wards, to wash sheets more frequently. But progress was slow, and for decades, vermin ruled unchecked. Their presence was a constant reminder that the boundary between healing and hell was perilously thin. And if the crawling, biting pests seemed unbearable, they were still only the beginning. For beyond the insects and rats lay another kind of torment, not of body, but of senses. A torment carried not by creatures, but by the very air itself, the stench of rot, the perfume of decay, the invisible poisons believed to rise from filth and death. If you thought scratching at lice in the dark was the worst of it, wait until you try breathing. The hospital air was an enemy of its own. It pressed itself into the lungs, heavy and foul, making each breath a reminder that survival was not guaranteed. No amount of shallow breathing could disguise what lingered in those wards, a mixture of blood, sweat, urine, feces, vomit, pus, disinfectant when it was available, and something darker still, the sweet, unmistakable perfume of human decay. Visitors wrote about it first. One step within the ward and the stench takes hold. One observer claimed, describing it as though the building itself were rotting from the inside out. Patients had no such luxury of shock. They had to lie there in it, hour after hour, day after day. The smell of their own illness was layered with the smells of dozens of others, a communal fog of suffering. And in those times, before the hum of electric fans or the swish of sterile air conditioning, there was no escape. Open windows were rare in the middle of London's soot, thick atmosphere, and when they were opened, all that floated in was the smell of horse dung, coal smoke, and sewage from the streets. Doctors and reformers spoke often of miasma, that invisible, poisonous fog believed to cause disease. And who could blame them for believing it? Anyone who stepped into a Victorian hospital and drew in one breath would be convinced something lethal was hiding in the air. Even without microbes to prove it, the body revolted. Nausea rose immediately, throats burned, and eyes watered. It felt dangerous because it was. The smell of blood dominated the surgical wards. Surgery, in an era before antiseptics, was not a quiet, careful affair but a rapid, brutal one. Sawdust was spread on the floor to catch dripping gore, and by the day's end, it was soaked dark and sticky. Surgeons wiped their knives on their aprons between procedures, and the scent of iron followed them like perfume. Patients smelled it too, the smell of others before them, of wounds opened and only partially closed. The air hung thick with it, cloying and metallic, a reminder that blood had already been spilled and would be again. Beyond the blood was the smell of pus. Wards filled with the infected gave off a sickly, sweet odor, thick enough to stick at the back of the throat. Bandages that were not changed often enough hardened with ooze, releasing gases of rot. The nurses who peeled them away sometimes gagged, though they became numb to it in time. For the patients, lying next to festering wounds not their own, the stench was constant, and there was the unmistakable odor of urine and feces, for chamber pots overflowed, and patients too weak to move often relieved themselves in bed. Straw mattresses absorbed it, creating a stinking stew beneath the bodies. Efforts were made to change bedding, but with so many patients and so little staff, it was rarely enough. The wards carried a permanent undertone of waste, sharp and acrid, woven into the smell of sickness, until one could not separate one from the other. But most haunting of all was the smell of death. Corpses were not immediately removed. Sometimes they lingered in the ward until staff could spare the time to carry them away. The cooling body gave off its own distinct perfume, faint at first, then overwhelming. It clung to everything, the walls, the sheets, the air itself. For patients still alive, breathing in that odor was a cruel reminder. This was what awaited them, perhaps sooner than they hoped. Modern complaints about hospital smell, antiseptic cleaners, rubber gloves, the faint tang of disinfectant, seem laughable when compared. That sharp sting of bleach many find unpleasant was, in Victorian days, a luxury. A clean smell was a rare, alien thing. Reformers like Florence Nightingale fought tirelessly against this invisible torment. She insisted that air be allowed to circulate, that windows be opened, that wards be aired out. She believed, quite correctly in her own way, that bad air killed. Even if her reasoning was miasma and not microbes, she saw what others ignored, that no healing could occur, where the very act of breathing made one weaker. Her campaigns pushed hospitals toward better ventilation, though the poorest wards lagged behind. The smell was not only physical, but psychological. Patients complained of dreams filled with rot, of nausea so strong they could not eat, of dread each time the night air grew still and the smells thickened. Nurses, exhausted, sometimes wept in private, their clothes saturated with odors they could never wash out. Doctors, pretending to be immune, stuffed cloves or tobacco in their mouths, breathing through the pungent cover. But no disguise lasted. The smell of the hospital was inescapable. A constant reminder that suffering was not confined to the body, but invaded every sense. And yet, over time, even the most sensitive nose dulled. Patients became so accustomed to the foul air that fresh air shocked them when they finally stepped outside. Some gasped at the strangeness of it, the way it stung their lungs, the way the world smelled too bright, too alive. That contrast was its own cruelty, to realize only after leaving how oppressive the hospital air had been. If you've ever wrinkled your nose walking past a trash bin on a hot day, that memory should be kept close. Now multiply it, layer it, let it ferment with sweat and decay, and imagine it not for a moment, but for weeks. That was Victorian hospital air, a companion that crawled into your lungs and stayed. And so the air itself became a patient's worst enemy. It weakened bodies already frail, stole appetites from the hungry, clouded minds with dread. Even reform could not entirely banish it. For as long as suffering and death gathered in close quarters, the perfume of misery lingered. But if the stench of the hospital was unbearable, it was not the only torment carried by the wards. For beneath the noise, the smells, the infestations, there was a deeper cruelty, one found in the very tools of healing. Crude, unclean, terrifying instruments of surgery and restraint that promised salvation while delivering agony. If you thought the air itself was merciless, wait until you see the surgeon's table. The surgeon's table was a place of legend, a stage where lives were gambled with steel and speed. But to call it a table was generous. More often it was a stained wooden slab, pitted from years of use, sticky from yesterday's operations. The sawdust that covered the floor to soak up blood clung to the wood, turning it gritty beneath the weight of trembling bodies. Instruments, if you could call them that, were laid out with grim practicality: saws, knives, clamps, and hooks. There was no stainless steel shine here, no glimmer of sterile precision. The blades were dulled by use, spotted with rust, sometimes bearing the dried traces of their last victim. Surgery in Victorian hospitals was not a matter of comfort but of survival, and survival depended on speed. The faster a limb was sawed off, the less chance the patient would die from blood loss or shock. Surgeons prided themselves on their swiftness, timing amputations like athletes shaving seconds off a race. 30 seconds for a leg, some boasted, as though the record itself were an achievement worth more than the life lying before them. Accuracy was secondary. Patients might survive without a leg, but they would not survive if the saw lingered. Anesthesia was not always at hand. Ether and chloroform were available by the mid-19th century, but supplies were inconsistent, and not every hospital could afford them. Even when they were used, doses were poorly measured, sometimes leaving the patient fully conscious, half-conscious, or dead from overdose. Many patients faced the saw without relief, restrained by nurses or ropes, biting down on leather straps, screaming until their voices broke. The sound of those screams filled the wards, echoing in the minds of those waiting their turn. Imagine, for a moment, lying on that table. You feel the surgeon's rough hand press your shoulder, telling you to be still. Around you, assistants tighten straps across your chest and legs. A cloth is shoved between your teeth, muffling your protests. Then the saw bites. Not gently, not slowly, but fast, tearing through flesh, cracking bone, vibrating through your very soul. The smell of burning bone fills the air as friction heats the saw. By the time it ends, you are not sure if you are alive or dead. And yet, survival was far from guaranteed. Instruments were rarely cleaned between operations. Surgeons wore their blood-stained coats like badges of honor, proof of their experience. Knives that cut one man's gangrenous leg in the morning might slice through another's arm in the afternoon, carrying infection like a silent passenger. Hospitals did not yet understand germs. Pus was seen as a healthy sign, proof that the body was healing. In truth, it was sepsis, creeping toward death. Infections raged after surgery. Wounds festered, swollen and red, oozing pus that glued bandages to skin. Patients weakened, fevers rose, and within days, the body succumbed. Some survived the knife only to die from the surgeon's ignorance. Amputations were the most common, and many wards echoed with the cries of those missing limbs, adjusting to a world that had suddenly taken half of them away. For surgeons, it was a brutal kind of practice. They were craftsmen more than healers, men whose reputations rested on how many operations they could complete, not how many patients they could save. Death was expected. It was part of the numbers. Some hospitals reported mortality rates so high that entering the surgical ward was almost a death sentence in itself. Patients begged to avoid it, but for many, the table was the only chance, no matter how slim. The tools themselves looked more suited for carpentry than medicine. Bone saws, amputation knives, forceps that resembled blacksmith's tongs. Blood spattered the handles, dried into cracks, never fully cleaned. A surgeon's kit was a chest of horrors, heavy with steel that gleamed not with light but with menace. And yet, these were the instruments of salvation. Or so it was said. Modern complaints about needles sting faintly compared to this. If you've ever flinched at the sight of a vaccination syringe, imagine instead a saw so dull it tore rather than sliced, wielded by a man more concerned with his timing than your agony. Suddenly, the pinch of a needle feels like a caress. And still, there was a strange kind of theatre in surgery. Students gathered to watch from galleries, their breaths quick with anticipation. The patient became a spectacle, the surgeon the star performer. Gasps followed each cut, cheers erupted at feats of speed. It was education, yes, but it was also entertainment, a grim show staged daily in the name of progress. Some surgeons gained reputations as miracle workers, though miracles were measured in survival against the odds. Others were whispered about in fear, their patients rarely seen walking again. The hospital's halls were haunted by these reputations, and the poor had little choice but to accept whichever surgeon fate assigned them. There was no shopping for the best, there was only submission to the saw, and the aftermath was no kender. Limbs were discarded in piles, tossed into buckets like offal from a butcher's stall. The sight alone was enough to turn stomachs. For patients waking from the haze, if they woke at all, the first question was often not, "Am I alive?" but, "Is it still there?" And the answer was, more often than not, no. The surgical wards were places of terror, where the smell of blood was constant, where screams rang daily, where survival was a gamble few won. And yet they were also places of strange hope, for without them, many would die untreated, gangrene spreading, bones shattered, fevers raging. It was a devil's bargain: suffer the saw, or suffer a slower, crueler death. If the instruments of surgery were crude and terrifying, the care that followed was little better. For once the knives were set aside, the patient returned to wards, where bandages stiffened with pus. Nurses struggled to keep order, and infection crept back in. If you thought the surgeon's table was the worst fate a Victorian hospital offered, wait until you see what passed for post-operative care. The saw had been set aside. The surgeon's bloodied apron was stiff, his hands sticky, his voice already rising in instructions for the next patient. The theatre crowd of students murmured among themselves, trading observations with the excitement of men leaving a play. And you, if you had survived the table, were dragged back to the ward. No applause, no cheer, only the heavy ache of what had been taken and the terror of what still might come. Recovery was not rest. It was another battlefield, though quieter, crueler, in its patience. The bed you were placed in was not fresh, not clean, but the same straw mattress that had held another body just days ago. Its surface was sour with sweat, its fabric crawling with unseen guests, and the sheets, if there were any, bore stains already yellowed with age. You were lowered into this nest of filth, your stump or wound wrapped in cloth that might have been boiled, or might simply have been wrung out and used again. Pain was constant, gnawing at every nerve. Laudanum might be given, or opium if the nurse had some to spare, but more often there was nothing but the thin comfort of a rag between the teeth. The cries of the surgical ward carried on through the night, each new operation echoing in the dreams of those who had just endured it. You tried to sleep, but the body would not allow it. The wound throbbed, the bandages itched, and each shift of the mattress brought a fresh wave of agony. The greatest enemy in recovery was infection. They called it hospital gangrene, a cruel term for what was little more than unchecked rot. The wound, once cut and bound, began to darken at the edges. Flesh that had been pink and raw turned grey, then black, then crumbled to the touch. The stench was unmistakable, sickly sweet, stronger even than the ordinary perfume of the ward. Nurses, hardened though they were, sometimes gagged when unwrapping such wounds. Patients screamed as the dead flesh was pared away, a futile attempt to halt the spread. Many did not survive more than a week. Fever stalked the survivors. It came in waves, sweat drenching their bodies, lips cracked with thirst. Some raved in delirium, clawing at their own wounds, whispering nonsense in voices too weak to carry. Others fell silent, eyes glassy, the fight drained from them. Bedmates watched in dread, knowing fever might strike them next. In the crowded ward, it often did. Nursing was a haphazard affair. Some nurses were devoted, washing wounds as best they could, bringing water, offering words of comfort. Others were indifferent, overworked, or openly cruel. Complaints of pain were dismissed as weakness. Requests for water ignored. A good nurse could mean the difference between survival and death, but good nurses were rare, and even they were powerless against the tide of infection. The food offered to recovering patients was little better than slop. Thin broth, stale bread, sometimes a bit of gruel. Those too weak to chew simply starved, their bodies wasting away, as the hospital provided fuel insufficient for healing. The smell of food was lost in the greater odor of the ward, though rats never missed it, their sharp noses leading them to scraps left on trays, or to crumbs dropped by trembling hands. There was no privacy. Your groans joined those of dozens of others, a chorus of pain sung nightly in the lamplight. Curtains were rare, and even when drawn, they offered no real separation. You watched others suffer, and others watched you. Death was never private. When the patient in the next bed breathed his last, his body might remain beside you for hours, cold hand brushing yours, until staff had time to remove him. You saw the end coming for others, and in your darkest moments, you imagined how soon it might come for you. If you've ever grown restless when your hospital roommate snores, spare a thought for the Victorian patient, who shared a ward not with one man, but with 40, all coughing, groaning, and moaning in concert. Suddenly, the hum of a modern CPAP machine seems like sweet music. For some, the recovery ward was a kind of purgatory. They lingered for weeks, neither improving nor declining, caught in the slow agony of wounds that refused to heal. Bandages stiffened with pus, rewrapped rather than replaced, became part of the body itself. Bedsores formed where flesh pressed too long against straw. Lice nested in hair, fleas bit at ankles, and all the while, the patient's strength waned. Each day was measured not in progress, but in survival to the next sunrise. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics beyond the occasional wash of carbolic acid in later years. Recovery depended not on medicine, but on luck that the wound would not rot. Luck that the fever would break. Luck that the body could withstand what the hospital itself inflicted. Most did not have such luck. Mortality after surgery was so high that some called the recovery wards waiting rooms for death, and yet hope persisted. Families visited, bringing flowers to mask the stench, bringing food in hopes of coaxing appetite. They prayed at bedsides, whispered encouragements, begged doctors for attention. Sometimes a miracle occurred. A wound healed clean, a fever broke, a patient stood again on unsteady legs. Such recoveries were celebrated, exaggerated, retold as proof that survival was possible. But for every one who walked out, dozens were carried out. The ward was filled with reminders of mortality. The buckets of discarded limbs, the smell of rot, the ever-present cries, all served to remind each patient of the odds stacked against them. And in that environment, despair was as lethal as infection. Many gave up, stopped eating, stopped fighting. Their bodies followed their spirits, slipping into silence. But for those who lingered, who clung to life despite the odds, another torment awaited: the endless, humiliating vulnerability of being trapped in a body too weak to care for itself. To be washed by a stranger, to be spoon-fed broth, to lie in your own filth until someone took pity. This was recovery. Pride eroded, dignity dissolved, until survival itself felt like surrender. And through it all, the surgeon's table waited, whispering its promise. For some, a second operation was needed. A stump had festered, a bone had set wrong, an infection required cutting away. To return to the table was a sentence few survived. Patients begged to be spared, to let nature take its course rather than the knife. The ward became a place not of healing, but of bargaining with fate. If you think the tedium of waiting for a doctor's rounds today is unbearable, imagine waiting not for advice, but for the verdict of whether you'd be returned to the sore. Suddenly, that 40-minute delay in modern hospitals feels like mercy, and still, life continued around the suffering. Nurses walked the aisles with their lanterns, surgeons lectured in corners, Cleaners swabbed ineffectually at bloodstains. Outside the windows, London's smoke rose as usual, indifferent to the screams inside. The city churned on, the hospital endured, and the patients suffered. Recovery was not an end but a continuation, another act in a play that had no curtain. The cruelest truth of all was that survival was rare enough to feel like accident. If you walked out of the hospital on your own feet, you were not just lucky, you were exceptional. The majority left only in boxes, their names scribbled into records, their bodies buried with little ceremony. Recovery wards, meant to heal, became graveyards of the living, each bed a marker, each groan a prayer. And yet worse still awaited beyond the wounds and fevers, for when death came, and it came often, it was not always the end of suffering. Bodies were not sacred in Victorian hospitals. They were commodities, resources for study, fuel for the surgeon's craft. If you thought your suffering ended with your last breath, you were mistaken. The next chapter of torment began when the body was no longer your own. The ward was never quiet. Even in the deepest hours of night, when the city outside hushed and the lanterns cast only the weakest glow, sound lingered. Someone coughed wetly into a rag. Someone else groaned in half-sleep, muttering names of family who were not there. A nurse's shoes tapped briskly across stone, her skirts brushing against bed frames as she moved. And then came the unmistakable sound of rats, the skittering claws against wood, the faint squeak as they argued over crumbs, or, more unsettling still, sought softer meals. Patients learned quickly not to leave their hands dangling from the bed. By day, the noise swelled to chaos. Surgeons swept through in their rounds, trailed by clusters of medical students eager to peer at wounds. Beds were not private sanctuaries but stages. Each patient turned into a specimen. Bandages were unwrapped with rough fingers, stumps lifted for inspection, oozing wounds poked at with blunt instruments. Students leaned in, sniffing, sometimes joking in tones that betrayed their detachment. Patients endured this theatre of recovery because there was no choice. To protest was to be ignored, or worse, punished with neglect. Imagine lying in agony, your wound raw and festering, while a gaggle of half-trained young men debate loudly over whether you'll survive another week. And then imagine one of them taking notes with the eagerness of a schoolboy, as though your suffering were no more than an experiment. In an era obsessed with scientific progress, patients were not partners in care, they were raw material. The air itself conspired against healing. The hospital smell was so infamous it had a name: hospital stink. It clung to clothing, hair, even skin, following visitors back into the streets like an invisible ghost. The stink came from a mix of rotting wounds, unwashed bedding, stagnant water, and the sheer press of humanity crammed into one unventilated space. Opening a window did little. London's air carried its own poisons: coal smoke, dung, sewage. The sick breathed in foulness with every breath, and their bodies weakened further. Visitors often fainted on entering the ward, overwhelmed by the smell. Doctors and nurses grew accustomed, their senses dulled, but newcomers reacted with horror. Yet for the patients, there was no escape. They lived in the stink, ate in it, dreamed in it, died in it. It was the atmosphere of their suffering, as integral to recovery as the bed itself. Every so often, epidemics swept through like wildfire. Typhus, smallpox, erysipelas. They thrived in the close quarters of the ward. One man's fever became another's plague. The unlucky were struck down even if they had not gone under the knife, their bodies too weak to fight the invading illness. When disease surged, the wards became slaughterhouses. Beds filled with the raving, the trembling, the blistered. Nurses worked frantically, surgeons grew grim, and still the deaths mounted. For the patients who survived their surgeries, survival against infection was often too much to hope for. In those times, the ward became something worse than a place of suffering. It became a place of waiting. Men and women lay side by side, watching one another decline, counting the hours until their own turn came. It was common for patients to beg to be moved, to be taken anywhere else, but beds were precious, and requests were denied. The weak remained, surrounded by the dying, until they too joined them. Even religion offered little comfort. Priests and ministers passed through, offering prayers, reading scripture, but death was too constant, too ordinary. Patients heard the same words over and over, until they became a hollow chant, stripped of meaning. For some, The prayers were salt in the wound, reminders that God had abandoned them to a fate worse than punishment. The mental toll was as heavy as the physical. Patients spoke of seeing faces in the shadows, hearing whispers at night, believing the hospital itself was cursed. And perhaps it was. For those trapped in its wards, surrounded by unending pain and death, it seemed less a place of healing than a pit where hope went to die. Yet humor persisted, strange as that may seem. Patients joked in gallows tones, nicknaming their wounds, making bets on who would survive the week. Some sang bawdy songs at night, their voices thin but defiant, as though to prove they had not yet surrendered. Even nurses, exhausted and overworked, cracked jokes at the bedside, masking their own despair. Laughter in the ward was not joy, it was rebellion. Of course, such rebellion was short-lived. Laughter often ended in coughing fits, in gasps of pain, in silence. Still, it flickered, a spark against the darkness. Even in hell, humanity clung to scraps of dignity. If you've ever complained about the hospital television being stuck on one channel, picture instead your only entertainment being the sight of your neighbor's gangrenous stump. At least daytime soaps don't smell like decay. Those who survived recovery bore scars beyond the physical. Many left the hospital maimed, weakened, or haunted by what they had seen. Some never shook the smell of hospital stink, swearing they could smell it years later in their own homes. Others feared doctors and hospitals for the rest of their lives, preferring death to another stay. Survival came with gratitude, yes, but also with trauma that lingered like an unwelcome companion. And yet, through all this misery, hospitals remained crowded. Why? Because there was no alternative. For the poor, there were no private physicians, no quiet convalescence in country estates. The hospital was the only option, a gamble between life and death. And though the odds were terrible, some still won. Those rare survivors spread their stories, tales of miraculous recoveries, proof that endurance could be rewarded. Their voices gave false hope to others, filling beds once more, sustaining the cycle. The recovery ward was, in truth, a cruel paradox, a place meant to heal that so often destroyed. Patients entered hoping for life, but most found only prolonged suffering. It was a place of contradictions. Hope and despair, humor and agony, survival and surrender. To experience it was to be reshaped, either in the grave or in the scars carried forever. But for those who perished, the story did not end with the last breath. The hospital had one more cruelty reserved, one more chapter in its saga of indignity. For bodies did not always leave the way families imagine. Some were destined for the dissecting table, their deaths feeding the endless hunger of medical science. If recovery was hell, death could be worse. Death in a Victorian hospital did not always bring peace. For many, it was only the beginning of another kind of exposure, another stage of humiliation, and another reminder that even in death, one did not belong to oneself. The ward might fall silent when a patient finally stopped breathing, but behind that silence lurked a new kind of appetite, one not for survival, but for knowledge. And knowledge, in this era, was often carved directly from the flesh of the dead. The moment death was confirmed, the body lingered where it lay, sometimes for hours, sometimes for an entire day, waiting until the staff had time to collect it. Neighbors in the next bed did not avert their eyes. They were forced to watch, reminded of the fate that might soon be theirs. Some whispered prayers, others turned their faces to the wall, but all breathed the stench that rose as the body cooled and began its slow surrender to decay. When porters finally arrived, the removal was rarely ceremonial. A blanket was thrown over the form, and it was hauled away on a stretcher with as little tenderness as one might carry a sack of coal. There was no procession, no solemn pause. The living patients received no words of comfort. Instead, the routine carried on as though nothing remarkable had occurred. To die in a hospital was to vanish with barely a ripple. But the fate of the body depended greatly on who it belonged to. Wealthier patients, if their families had means, could arrange for immediate removal and burial. But for the poor, and they made up the majority, the hospital itself often claimed the corpse. The Anatomy Act of 1832 had opened the door for medical schools to use unclaimed bodies, and hospitals were eager to supply them. A patient without family, or with family too poor to pay burial costs, might find their body destined for dissection. This grim reality hung over the wards like a shadow. Patients whispered of it. sometimes in terror, sometimes with bitter resignation. To be cut open after death was seen not as a scientific honor, but as a desecration, a theft of dignity. In a society obsessed with burial rites, where the body's rest was bound to the soul's peace, dissection was viewed as a fate worse than death itself, yet many had no power to resist it. The dissecting rooms were cold bare, and smelled of spirits meant to preserve the flesh. Bodies were laid out on long tables, their limbs spread for examination, their chests open to eager eyes. Students crowded around, knives in hand, eager to learn anatomy not from books but from real, tangible flesh. They carved, they labeled, they studied, and they joked. The body was no longer a person but a map of sinew and bone, a teaching tool stripped of identity. Some corpses went even further in their afterlives, preserved in jars, displayed in cabinets, or used as practice for surgical techniques. Families might never know that their loved one's face, once familiar, had become anonymous, floating in alcohol on a shelf. The body in death was consumed as thoroughly by science as it had been by illness. Imagine lying in a ward, fever burning through you, and hearing footsteps outside your curtain. You know that if you slip away tonight, your body may not be placed in the ground, but laid out under the knives of strangers. It is hard to imagine rest with that knowledge gnawing at the edge of your thoughts. The threat of dissection gave rise to desperate measures. Families scraped together pennies to afford even the cheapest coffin, terrified of leaving their dead to the mercy of the hospital. Some begged officials, others bribed attendants to ensure a body's release. There were stories of corpses stolen back by grieving relatives, whisked away in the night to be buried secretly, away from the hungry eyes of medical students. Yet not all succeeded. The poor, the lonely, the abandoned, these filled the dissecting tables. For them, death was not the end of indignity, but its cruel continuation. They became anonymous donors to science, not by choice, but by circumstance. And science was voracious. Hospitals were engines of both death and knowledge, feeding themselves on the very people they claimed to serve. The irony was sharp. Patients who had endured agony in the surgical wards, who had clung to life through fever and infection, might finally find release in death, only to be dragged back into service. Even their corpses were not spared labor. They became silent teachers, unwilling contributors to progress, fueling discoveries that would help others, but never themselves. If you've ever signed the little organ donor box on your license, consider how voluntary that act is. Now imagine instead that your consent was irrelevant. Your body already promised away before you'd even drawn your last breath. Suddenly, that sticker in your wallet feels like a luxury of autonomy unknown to the Victorians. Some surgeons justified the practice, insisting that the poor were repaying society with their remains, balancing the debt of their medical care. Others spoke loftily of advancing knowledge, of serving a higher purpose. But for patients, these words rang hollow. Few believed they were being honored in death. Most saw only theft, a final act of exploitation by an institution that had already taken their health, their comfort, and often their lives. And so the wards filled not only with fear of pain and infection, but with fear of what came after. Death was not merely the loss of breath, but the loss of self. Patients clung to life, not always because they hoped to survive, but because they feared what awaited their body if they did not. Survival meant dignity. Death meant becoming meat for the dissecting knife. The horror extended beyond the walls. Rumors of hospital dissections spread in the streets, feeding distrust of doctors. Some avoided hospitals entirely, preferring to die at home rather than risk the fate of dissection. Others whispered of surgeons hastening death in hopeless cases, eager to secure fresh bodies. Whether true or not, the suspicion lingered, staining the profession with shadows. Inside the hospital, the practice bred silence. Patients rarely spoke of their fears openly, but it showed in their eyes when attendants passed. It showed in the way they grasped their families' hands, begging them to take them home before it was too late. And it showed in the bitterness of those who had seen neighbors vanish under blankets, never to return, their absence explained with evasive words. Death in the Victorian hospital was a kind of theft. It stole the body, the dignity, and the peace of those who had already suffered enough. It turned patients into objects, stripping them of humanity, at the very moment they should have been most human. To die there was to become part of the hospital forever, even when your soul had long since departed. If you think the anxiety of hospital paperwork today is stressful, imagine paperwork that decided whether your body was buried or dissected. A missing signature, a forgotten fee, and your eternal rest might be interrupted by a scalpel. Suddenly, that clipboard full of forms in a modern waiting room seems like a small price to pay. And yet, there was worse still. Beyond death, beyond dissection, beyond all the humiliation of the hospital, one more torment lingered. For not all bodies left through the dissecting room. Some remained, trapped in jars, bones on shelves, or, more disturbingly, as cautionary tales displayed for students and visitors alike. If you thought suffering ended with the grave, or even with the surgeon's blade, you would be mistaken. There was still more to fear, waiting in the shadows of the hospital's darkest rooms. In the dim wards of the Victorian hospital, pain was constant, but so too was curiosity. Surgeons, driven by ambition and a hunger for discovery, saw not only suffering patients but opportunities. Each wound, each fever, each swollen limb was a question begging to be answered, and the patient who carried it became a living experiment. Consent, as we understand it today, was a luxury the Victorians rarely considered. To be admitted to the hospital was to place your body, not just in the hands of doctors, but in the notebooks of students, the debates of lecturers, and the experiments of men eager to make their mark. The experiments began subtly. A surgeon might decide to try a new bandaging technique, or to apply a poultice mixed with strange powders, or to pour carbolic acid directly into a wound. Sometimes these interventions helped, but more often they stung, burned, or worsened infection. Patients were told little. A nurse might mutter that, "The doctor wants to try something," and that was that. You endured whatever was applied, your suffering turned into a trial run. Then came the medicines. Victorians loved their potions, their tinctures, their tonics. Laudanum, opium, chloroform, mercury, arsenic, substances that today would be locked behind warnings, were ladled out in spoonfuls. Doctors experimented freely with dosages, increasing or reducing according to whim. Some patients floated away into delirium, others writhed in new agonies, and a few never woke again. When one mixture failed, another was tried, the human body little more than a vessel for endless chemical trials. The cruelest experiments were those performed under the guise of surgery. New instruments demanded new victims, and hospitals provided them in abundance. A man might arrive with a broken limb, only to find himself subjected to a surgeon's latest invention, an odd clamp, a sharper saw, a more elaborate stitch. Each was tested not on models or cadavers but on the living, whose cries became part of the surgeon's assessment. Success was measured not in comfort, but in whether the limb held, whether the blood slowed, whether the patient lingered long enough to be deemed proof of concept. Imagine, for a moment, lying in a bed with fever eating at your strength, when the surgeon strides in with a cluster of students. He announces that you will be an excellent case for demonstrating a new treatment. You are too weak to argue, too frightened to resist. And so, before eager eyes, he prods, cuts, injects, or incises, all while narrating your body as though it were no more than parchment on which he scribbled. In this theatre, your pain was irrelevant. What mattered was the lesson, the advancement, the applause at the end. Patients spoke of being treated like specimens, of becoming stories for future lectures. Their names vanished, replaced by phrases like, "the man with the ulcerated leg," or "the woman with the rotting jaw." Identity dissolved into diagnosis. To survive was to be remembered only as a case, a line in a notebook, a whisper in a lecture hall. To die was to be forgotten entirely, except as a footnote to the experiment that failed. If you've ever grumbled when your doctor Googles your symptoms in front of you, imagine instead being turned into the live search result, you're suffering the raw data to be discussed over dinner. Suddenly, the awkward pause while a physician checks WebMD doesn't feel so insulting. Some experiments were performed with a kind of innocent ambition. Surgeons were desperate to reduce pain, to save lives, to make medicine something greater than butchery. But their methods often outpaced their wisdom. Chloroform, for instance, was hailed as a miracle when introduced, yet its dosage was erratic. Too little, and the patient screamed throughout the procedure. Too much, and the heart stopped instantly. Entire wards became proving grounds for this delicate balance, with unlucky patients falling on either side of the knife's promise. Worse still were the public demonstrations. Surgeons invited not only students but also wealthy patrons, politicians, and curious visitors to watch experimental procedures. Patients, often poor and voiceless, became spectacles. Their bodies were opened, their agonies displayed, their outcomes debated like curiosities at a fair. The thin curtain between medicine and theatre was shredded, and what remained was a carnival of suffering presented as science. Nurses sometimes tried to shield their patients, whispering reassurances, smoothing brows, or protesting quietly when experiments went too far. But nurses had little power against the authority of surgeons. At best, they could soften the edges of cruelty. At worst, they were reduced to assistants, binding limbs tighter, holding patients still as the experiment began. Those who survived such trials carried more than scars. They bore the knowledge that their survival had been a coin toss, that their bodies had been used as stepping stones for others. Some wore their scars with bitter pride, proof that they had endured what should never have been endured. Others carried shame, convinced they had been treated like less than human. Hospitals created not just patients, but relics of their ambition, walking reminders of medicine's appetite for experimentation. And through it all, the hospitals thrived. Each successful experiment, each new discovery, was trumpeted as progress. And in truth, progress was made. Techniques were refined. Infections sometimes reduced, pain occasionally lessened. But the cost was staggering. Behind every celebrated breakthrough lay a trail of bodies, nameless and forgotten, their suffering paved over by the march of medicine. If you think clinical trials today are scary, with their endless consent forms and fine print, remember the Victorian alternative: no forms, no warnings, no choice. You were the trial, and your signature was your scream. In this way, the hospital became not just a place of healing or dying, but a crucible for knowledge forged from pain. Patients entered with fear, endured with endurance, and often left either maimed or buried. Their legacy was not their own. It belonged to the doctors who experimented on them, the students who took notes, and the textbooks that would one day describe their case without ever mentioning their name. And as grim as this seems, one final horror remained. If you thought the experiments ended with your last breath, you were wrong. Because in some corners of the Victorian hospital, even the dead were dragged back into the cycle of trial and error. Their flesh, their bones, their very remains became objects of endless study, dissected again and again, as though death itself were not enough to free them from the hospital's grip. The Victorian hospital was never just a building. It was a world of its own, a place where rules bent, where the boundary between life and death blurred, and where suffering became currency. To step inside its walls was to surrender not only your body but your fate. For some, it was a gamble worth taking. For most, it was the beginning of a descent into misery so profound it still echoes across centuries. Every detail of its existence seemed designed to break the patient. The stench clung like a second skin, saturating every breath, every bite of food, every restless attempt at sleep. The straw mattresses harbored lice and vermin. The wards echoed with a chorus of groans, rattles, and screams. Death was not an intruder here, it was a resident sitting at the bedside, waiting its turn. And when it came without grace, stripping dignity as efficiently as the surgeon saw stripped flesh. Hospitals were supposed to be sanctuaries, but they were more like cages, trapping the poor within walls where their suffering could be studied, documented, and dissected. The wealthy avoided them when they could, hiring physicians to visit their homes, keeping illness private and dignified. But the poor had no such luxury. They arrived at the hospital with hope, only to find themselves raw material for a brutal system. The cruelty was not always intentional. Many surgeons believed themselves pioneers, men of science driving progress forward. Their knives, their experiments, their endless hunger for knowledge, all of it was cast in the language of advancement. And indeed, medicine did advance. Anesthesia improved, antiseptics eventually gained traction, survival rates inched upward. But progress was written in blood, and its ledger was filled with the names of the nameless. For the patients, the hospital was less a place of healing than a gauntlet. To survive, one needed luck to avoid infection. Luck to avoid being chosen for an experiment. Luck to have a family capable of rescuing the body from dissection. Each stage of the ordeal was another roll of the dice, another turn on the wheel. And the wheel turned often against them. Even those who survived were never truly free. They carried scars, physical, mental, spiritual, that lingered long after discharge. Some walked with twisted stumps where limbs had been, others with faces marred by crude surgery. Many carried nightmares, memories of screams echoing in dark wards, of neighbors slipping silently into death, of surgeons debating their fate as if they were cattle at market. Survival meant escape, but never erasure. If you've ever left a modern hospital complaining about bland food or slow Wi-Fi, remember that your ancestors left with missing limbs, infected wounds, and the faint smell of decay still clinging to their clothes. By comparison, lukewarm jello suddenly seems a feast. The final cruelty of the Victorian hospital was its indifference. It did not care who you were before you entered. Rich or poor, sinner or saint, once you lay in its bed, you became the same, a patient, a specimen, a body. The hospital consumed individuality as thoroughly as it consumed life. You were remembered only in ledgers, in notes, in bones displayed in teaching rooms. You were not mourned by the institution, only replaced by the next body in line. And yet, for all its horrors, the Victorian hospital was necessary. Without it, medicine would not have advanced, knowledge would not have grown, and future generations would not enjoy the safety and comfort of modern care. The suffering of thousands paved the way for antiseptics, anesthesia, and the very idea of patient dignity. The living hell of the Victorian hospital was the crucible in which modern medicine was forged. But that truth is little comfort to those who endured it. They did not suffer for progress. They suffered because they had no choice. Their misery was not noble sacrifice but exploitation. And as we look back, the temptation is to applaud the doctors and surgeons for their bravery, their innovation. Yet the truer story is one of patients, ordinary men, women and children, who bore the pain, whose blood fueled discovery, and whose deaths became stepping stones on the path to healing others. Hospitals today are clean, bright, filled with machines that hum instead of scream. Yet if you close your eyes, you can still feel the echo of that other place, the straw beds, the sawdust floors, the lanterns casting shadows over trembling figures. The Victorian hospital is gone, but its ghost lingers, reminding us that progress is rarely gentle. So the next time you lie in a hospital bed, irritated by the beeping of monitors, or the long wait for a nurse, think of those who lay before you in the wards of the 19th century. Think of the screams that filled the night, the stench that clung to every breath, the fear that even death might not bring peace. And then, perhaps, whisper a silent thanks to those forgotten souls, for without their suffering, your discomfort would be far, far worse. Because if you thought Victorian hospitals were hell while alive, remember this, even in death, the hospitals sometimes refuse to let you go.